All right, everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to talk about electrolyte balance and also imbalance. And so there's going to be sort of a lot of text on these slides, guys. So I apologize for that. And then there's going to be some some larger vocabulary words that we're going to get into. So just try to stick with me and take notes. Um, First of all, electrolytes in living systems, including our body, include sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarb, calcium, phosphate, magnesium, copper, blah, 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 all of those. But in terms of body functioning, there's six that are going to be most important in what we'll talk about today. Sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, calcium, and phosphate. Those six ions aid in nerve excitability, endocrine secretion, membrane permeability, buffering of body fluids, and controlling the movement of fluids between compartments. Those ions enter your body through your digestive tract, through the food that you eat. More than 90% of the calcium and the phosphate that enters the body is incorporated into bones and teeth, with bones serving as a mineral reserve for these ions. So if calcium and phosphate is ever needed in the body, you can start breaking it down from the bone. If calcium and, like I just said, if calcium and phosphate are needed for the other functions, you can break down the bone tissue. Phosphate is a normal constituent of nucleic acids. Hence, blood levels of phosphate will increase whenever nucleic acids are broken down. Okay, so the first we'll get into is sodium. Sodium's a cation, positive ion, and it's denoted by Na+. It's the major cation of the extracellular fluid. It's responsible for 1/2 of the osmotic pressure gradient that exists between the interior of cells and their surrounding environment. In our typical Western diet, we routinely take in 130 to 160 millimoles per day of sodium, but we only require 1 to 2 millimoles per day. So that's pretty impressive, and I'm sure depending on the foods that we eat, we can take in much more than 130 to 160. That's obviously not too good because that excess sodium appears to be a major factor in hypertension, which is high blood pressure. And obviously that's what we've learned from blood pressure lectures is hypertension is extremely damaging. So that's unfortunate, but obviously makes our food taste really good. Excretion of sodium is accomplished primarily by your kidneys. Sodium is freely filtered through the glomerular capillaries of the kidneys, and although much of that filtered sodium is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, some remains in the filtrate in urine, and it's normally excreted through urination. If levels of sodium become imbalanced, there's two different ways, either too high or too low. Hyponatremia is a lower than normal concentration of sodium, usually associated with excess water accumulation in the body, which dilutes the sodium. An absolute loss of sodium would be due to a decreased intake of the ion in your food, coupled with its continual excretion in the urine. An abnormal loss of sodium from the body could result from several things like excessive sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, the use of diuretics to make you pee more, which obviously excretes it. That can occur if you have diabetes or acidosis, and either metabolic acidosis or diabetic ketoacidosis. And then on the other end of that spectrum is hypernatremia, and it's an abnormal increase of blood sodium, and it can result from water loss from the blood, resulting in the hemoconcentration of all blood constituents. And then hormonal imbalances involving antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone might result in that because they will make you urinate. It can make you urinate much more, and that could also result in higher than normal sodium values. Okay, potassium K+. Potassium is the major intracellular cation. It helps establish the resting membrane potential in neurons and muscle fibers after membrane depolarization and action potentials. So if you remember when we were talking about how membrane depolarization and action potentials worked, we talk about how the cell will release potassium. In contrast to sodium, potassium has very little effect on osmotic pressure. Low levels of potassium in the blood, because of sodium-potassium pumps in the cell membranes, will help to maintain concentration gradients between the intercellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. The recommended daily intake and consumption of potassium is 4,700 milligrams, and potassium gets excreted through the renal tubules, especially in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. Okay, so if we have a potassium imbalance, the first is hypokalemia, which is an abnormally low potassium blood level. That can occur either because of an absolute reduction of potassium in the body or a relative reduction of potassium in the blood due to the redistribution of potassium. An absolute loss of potassium could arise from either just decreasing the intake in your diet, and that happens frequently due to starvation, and it also can come about, of course, from vomiting, diarrhea, or alkalosis. On the other end of the spectrum, we have hyperkalemia, and that's an elevated potassium blood level, and that can also impair the function of skeletal muscles, the nervous system, and the heart. How does this happen? It can obviously be through increased dietary intake of potassium, and in such a situation, potassium from the blood ends up in the extracellular fluid in abnormally high concentrations. And if that's the case, it can cause unwanted depolarization or excitation of plasma membranes of the skeletal muscle fibers or neurons or cardiac cells of your heart, and can lead to an inability of the cells to repolarize. What that means is, particularly for the heart, is that it won't relax after a contraction, and it'll effectively seize and stop pumping blood, which is fatal within minutes. What you'll actually see is that the lethal injection, it used to be potassium, because it would just stop your heart very, very quickly. A person with hyperkalemia, it might exhibit mental confusion, numbness, weakened respiratory muscles, and of course, death very, very quickly. Okay, the next is chloride, which is an anion, a negative ion. It is the predominant extracellular anion. It's a major contributor to the osmotic pressure gradient between the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid, and it plays an important role in maintaining proper hydration. Hypochloremia is a lower than normal blood chloride level, and it can occur because of defective renal tubular absorption, vomiting, diarrhea, or metabolic acidosis can also lead to it. And then on the end, hyperchloremia is a higher than normal blood chloride levels. That can occur due to dehydration, excessive intake of salt, swallowing seawater, taking too much aspirin, congestive heart failure, and hereditary chronic lung disease or cystic fibrosis. In fact, in people who have cystic fibrosis, chloride levels in sweat are 2 to 5 times those of normal levels, and analysis of sweat is often used to diagnose cystic fibrosis. Okay, bicarbonate. We've heard about bicarbonate before. It is the most abundant anion in the blood, and its principal function is to maintain your body's acid-base balance by being part of buffer systems, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But bicarbonate ions result from a chemical reaction that starts with carbon dioxide and water, two molecules that we know are produced at the end of aerobic metabolism. Only a small amount of carbon dioxide can be dissolved in the body fluids, and so over 90% of that remaining carbon dioxide is converted into bicarbonate. Here's calcium, Ca+. After 2 pounds of calcium, there's about 2 pounds of calcium in your body, and they're bound up in bone, which provides hardness to the bone and serves as a mineral reserve for calcium and its salts for the rest of the tissues. Teeth also have a high concentration of calcium within them. A little more than 1/2 of blood calcium is bound to proteins, leaving the rest in its ionized form, which is actually Ca2+. I have a mistake up there. Calcium ions are Ca2+, and they're necessary for muscle contraction, enzyme activity, blood coagulation, and in addition, it helps to stabilize cell membranes and is essential for the release of neurotransmitters from neurons and of hormones from endocrine glands. Calcium is absorbed through the intestines, and we absolutely need the activated form of vitamin D to do that. If you have a deficiency of vitamin D, that could lead to a decreased amount of absorbed calcium and eventually a depletion of calcium stores from the skeletal system, potentially leading to rickets in children and osteomalacia in adults, contributing to osteoporosis, or what that means is holes in your bones, creating weakened bones. If you have a calcium imbalance, hypocalcemia is an abnormally low calcium blood level. That's seen in hyperthyroidism. It might follow the removal of your thyroid gland because the four nodules of the parathyroid gland are embedded in it. And hypercalcemia, of course, is abnormally high calcium blood levels. It's seen in primary hyperthyroidism, and some malignancies may also result in hypercalcemia. Okay, and then we're getting into phosphate. Phosphate is present in the body in three different ionic forms: H2PO4 minus, HPO2, and PO3 minus 4. The most common is HPO2 4 minus, and bone and teeth bind up 85% of the body's phosphate as part of calcium phosphate salts. Phosphate is also, as we know, found in phospholipids, like those that make up cell membranes. You find phosphate in ATP, in nucleotides, and also in buffers. If you have hypophosphatemia, that's abnormally low phosphate blood levels. That occurs if you use heavy antacids and during alcohol withdrawal, during malnourishment. Um, if your kidneys are faced with phosphate depletion, the kidneys will usually conserve phosphate, but during starvation, this conservation is obviously greatly impaired. And if you have hyperphosphatemia, which is, of course, abnormally increased level of phosphates, there's a decreased renal function, or in cases of acute lymphocytic leukemia. Additionally, phosphate is a major constituent of the intracellular fluid, and any significant destruction of cells will result in the dumping of phosphate into the extracellular fluid. And with that, we're going to call it there. We got one more video coming for this chapter talking about acids and bases.